All right, I'm going to get started. Thank you all for coming. I'm Ternus. I'm a security researcher at Akamai Technologies, and I'm part of the adversarial resilience team there. First, just a quick agenda. In approximate order, I'm going to talk about adversaries, what we're seeing day to day, the way that the threats are evolving. I'm going to talk about Akamai and what I mean by planetary scale in the title of this talk. I'm going to talk about resilience, what we mean when we think about resilience, the way that we consider it day to day, and the way that we use it to inform our decisions. And then I'm going to put it all together by talking about how we use adversarial techniques at Akamai to make ourselves safer. So without further ado, let's talk about adversaries. Good, that happened. All right, it's 2013. We've been running the Red Queen's race for a while. We're evolving pretty fast. We're coming out with new technologies. We're building up new defenses. But the adversaries are evolving just as fast as we are. We see new attackers every day. We see attackers using new techniques. They're coming from new places, or they're using old techniques in new ways. Attacks are coming from regions of the world, for example, developing economies, where we haven't traditionally seen them before. Botnets are becoming smarter and larger. Earlier today, my boss, Eric Coburn, gave a talk about the Brobot botnet, and we're seeing more sophisticated techniques being used to attack our systems. The upshot of all this is that we've lost the capability, if we ever even had it in the first place, to always know in advance what our adversaries are going to look like. The traditional security cycle, we take a hit, we comes in, we analyze it, we figure out what's going on, we figure out what went wrong, we figure out a fix, patch it, push it out, test it, and then we're done. We still need to do that, but it's no longer enough. It is necessary, but it is no longer sufficient. So what do we need to do? We need to be thinking adversarially. So what do we mean when we talk about adversaries? Really, this is a broad category. It covers a lot of stuff. Adversaries have a range of resources available to them. We consider time and bandwidth and money. This can be anywhere from a single hacker experimenting to a group of dissidents like Anonymous. It can be a rival company or an evil ISP, or it could even be a nation state trying to attack us. Adversaries have a variety of resources available to them. They also have a variety of information available. This is one of the primary factors that distinguishes an insider threat from an outsider threat. We have to consider the possibility, when we're thinking about Akamai, that one of our adversaries might have access to Akamai's secrets. What does this mean? It means that we can't close off an area of investigation just because, oh, that could only happen if the attacker had access to Akamai keys, to Akamai information. We have to consider the possibility of internal and external threats. We can't close off areas of inquiry just because of that. They also might have different skill sets, anywhere from script kiddies to so-called advanced persistent threats. An adversary might have any range of skills. This means that we can't close off an inquiry area because it requires a skill in order to find a vulnerability. They also have a range of motivations available to them. They want different things out of an attack. Some adversaries, chaotic actors as we call them, just want to cause chaos. They want to get their name in the news, perhaps. They want publicity for one of their causes. Or they want to advance a particular political goal. We see this in Anonymous with their different operations. We also see this coming from political actors who want to, say, make a point in support of or against Israel. Just as an example. Others might want to cause us economic damage. They want to attack a bank or a particular area of investigation just because they want to cause economic damage. The upshot of this is that we can't fix these parameters. We can't know in advance what an attacker is going to look like. We can't know in advance what an attack is going to be shaped like, so we can't always predict that in advance. And we can't perfectly counter any possible move. So that sounds pretty bad. What are the stakes here? I'm going to talk about Akamai for a little bit. For those of you who may not know, Akamai is a big content delivery network and a cloud services provider. Who here has used the internet today? All of you, right? Yeah, you're welcome. I promised I would work that in. We have more points of presence out there than anyone I know. Not just a lot of servers, but a lot of places our servers are located. If you were online today, you communicated with an Akamai server. We deliver a third of the world's web traffic for a huge number of popular names. Why am I mentioning this to you? Not just because I want to advertise Akamai, but because I want to make the point that our attack surface is huge. People attack us because they want to attack one of our customers. An attack against one of our customers is ultimately going to hit one of our servers. This is what Eric Coburn was mentioning in his robot talk. Ultimately, we're the ones who end up dealing with this traffic. This means there are a lot of challenges facing us. Not only is our demand increasing constantly through natural customer growth and natural traffic growth, but since we serve so many different customers, we have this big attack surface. This has its advantages. It means we're constantly being tested. It means we're constantly getting this feedback of whether or not our systems are good enough. The fact that we're still around means we must be doing something right. But I want to state the stakes as clearly as possible. I said planetary scale here. What does that mean? It doesn't just mean that our services are all over the planet. It doesn't just mean that we're serving people all around the world. This is what it means. If we go away, the internet goes away. We serve traffic, but what's more is we cache it. Traffic flows through us. Someone makes the request, it hits one of our servers, and it doesn't go any further. We serve it right back to them. What happens if we shut off all of our servers, or if all of our servers go down due to an attack? The internet goes through global congestive collapse. The backbone networks don't have the capability to serve all of the traffic that would result if Akamai were to fall over. Those are what the stakes are. This is what we're reminded of every day. This is what we tell all of our new employees. This is what we need to be keeping in mind when we're thinking about how to defend ourselves. So it seems like we're in a little bit of a bind here. We don't know what a hit would look like. We don't know what our attackers are going to look like, but we know we have to survive. What we need is a way to understand how we respond to adversarial pressure. Now, Bruce Schneier had a quote I'm going to put up here I really like. What he said is, if security won't work in the end, what is the solution? Resilience, building systems able to survive unexpected and devastating attacks, is the best answer we have right now. We need to recognize that large-scale attacks will happen, that our systems can survive more than we give them credit for, and that we can design them to survive these kinds of attacks. He was talking about global infrastructure, not just the internet, but I think it applies pretty well to us. Resilience is the answer. Our systems need to be resilient. So what does that mean? This is the working definition of resilience we use. We have to adapt to pressure in order to continue operating. This doesn't mean that we need to continue operating fully, completely, as best we can. It means we need to do our best to continue serving traffic. It means that even if we don't serve it to everyone, we still need to serve it to someone. How do we know that we can do that? How do we design resilient systems, and how do we know our systems are resilient? I can only talk about how Akamai does it. There are a lot of different approaches to making your systems resilient, but here's the things we like to do. I'm part of the security architecture team here at Akamai. I mentioned that. And we have a number of ways that we build resilience into our systems. We make it an important cultural value. Josh Corman, one of the organizers of this conference, he co-founded this little initiative called Rugged Software. And part of that is to make your software, to make the developers of your software understand that to a certain extent, your software is always mission critical. It's always going to be used for things that you didn't anticipate. It's always going to be used much longer than you anticipated. It's always going to get more traffic directed against it than you ever imagined. So in a sense, you almost have to over-engineer. You have to over-plan because you never know when your little toy project is going to end up being our next big moneymaker. Yeah, I see Andy laughing over there. So we make it an important cultural value and we build it into our designs. We also try to know the landscape. We try to know where attacks are coming from. I said before that we can't perfectly predict it, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. The security architecture team also reviews systems. We review architecture designs. We make everyone put in a security considerations section into their designs. And one of the things we look at is resilience. I was in a meeting last week. Someone was presenting one of their designs to me. And I said, okay, but what happens if this server goes away? What happens if you stop being able to serve keys to this location? Does everyone just get DOSed? They said, yeah, that's kind of what happens right now. And I said, well, you got to think about that, because you don't always know that this communication path is going to be there. You got to build it in. You got to make it robust. You got to make it resilient. And then there's mostly the rest of what I'm going to talk about today, namely the adversarial resilience team. We have one job: to think and act like the adversary to make Akamai safer. What does that mean? We think like the adversary, we act like the adversary before the adversary does. We want to model our own resilience. We want to be honest with ourselves about how resilient our systems are. To do that, we have to think like the adversary. We also have to be committed, and not in the way that sounds, but I'll get to that later. Yeah, I see you again laughing over there, Andy. So we have to think like the adversary. What does that mean? It means we black box our own systems. It means we look in from the outside, we discard what we know, we build a mental model of our own systems that matches what an adversary might see. It means we have to be willing to think around and through our abstraction barriers. It means we have to question our own assumptions about what we think we know. It means we have to know our own tech inside and out. We have to be willing to learn new technologies at the drop of a hat. Someone comes into our office and says, I hear there's a new Rails vulnerability. Does anyone here know Rails? And we look at each other and say, well, nobody here does. Guess that means one of us has to learn real fast. One of the things that we test for when we hire is, can you pick up a system in a language you haven't seen before and approximately understand what it does? To understand the basic structure of systems enough that you can interpret something and make, possibly inaccurate, but reasonable statements about it. It means we have to be persistent. We have to not give up, because the adversary isn't going to. It also means we have to have a certain mindset. Someone said I shouldn't characterize this as being evil, but having an adversarial mindset means we have to think in terms of creative destruction. There are a few of us who swim in the deep end of the alignment pool, down here, if you know what I mean. All three members, this was an alignment chart I made of people in InfoSec. You might recognize some people here. But all three of the people at the bottom here are members of adversarial resilience. It means we have to find joy in the destruction of beautiful things. Sometimes when we're hiring, what we really want to test for is the adversarial mindset. Eric talked a little bit about that before. And that means that you have to take the same sort of joy that a lot of people take in creating something from destroying it, from finding a vulnerability in something. This will be familiar to a lot of the pen testers out there, that when you discover something, your reaction isn't, ooh, that's terrible, but that guy there is particularly notable for that. So you might ask, why do we black box our own systems? Surely we'll get better data if we take into account what we know already. We're building up all this knowledge about Akamai, so why do we just toss it out the window when it comes time to evaluate things? There are a few good reasons for this. First is that I think doing so is more realistic. We'll get a better idea of what an attacker can see if we don't use any of our special access when we're coming in from the outside. It also means we get better buy-in. If we're going to a team and saying, hey, we found this vulnerability, we think there's a DOS attack vector out there against your software, and they say, okay, so how'd you find that? We said, oh, well, we looked at the source code and we used one of our keys and we accessed this thing, we were able to take it down. They say, well, that doesn't sound too realistic. That doesn't sound like something just an external attacker might be able to come up with, so we don't really think that's a threat. And then you have to go through the loop again and again trying to convince them that they should take it seriously. On the other hand, if you come at it from the outside and say, we didn't use any special knowledge to come up with this. We just looked at it from the outside. We did a couple port scans. We ran this protocol against it, and it crashed. And we did, anyone out there could do that. The only thing is that no one's done it yet. We tend to get a very different response that way. We get the response of, yeah, we better deal with that. It's also good practice for us. One of our advantages is that we're constantly rediscovering our own systems. When you're building a complex system, a lot of what you do is make assumptions. You're making assumptions about how the world works, and we call this abstraction. It's an incredibly powerful advantage, as I'm sure you all know, because it means you don't have to sweat the details. But our job, to a certain extent, is to sweat the details, to know where two models of the world don't match up perfectly. And so if we're constantly rediscovering our own systems, we know when something's changed. When someone has made an assumption in 2010 that no longer holds up in 2013, like this system will never be deployed in this location, or this protocol will never be used for that, or no one would ever run mission-critical infrastructure over this toy project. And it's also humbling. It's really tempting to think of yourself as special and smart. When we hire, we only want to hire special and smart people. And so when you think, oh, well, I can discover this, but no one else can, we don't have to worry about that because only really, really intelligent people could come up with this. If we don't use any special knowledge, we can keep in mind the mantra, there is nothing special about us. If we can discover something, so can they. And that helps keep us in perspective. And sure, it's difficult to temporarily switch off things you know. It's difficult to temporarily forget that backdoor that you discovered last week. But like a good magician, we have to hold contradicting ideas in our heads, and we have to believe them wholeheartedly. Of course, this is really difficult, but it's what we got to do. Speaking of challenges, there are three main categories of challenges that we face that I want to talk about briefly. I've broken them out into three categories: limited resources, complex systems, and entrenched resistance, or simply economic, technical, and human challenges. And I'm going to go over these one by one. The first area of challenge is economic. We have limited resources available to us, just like any other team. We're a small team, but we're growing. And we have a number of other responsibilities as members of InfoSec and the security architecture team. This is going to be the case for anyone. This is going to be the case for any team anywhere. You don't have all the resources. You never have all the resources you want to do everything you want. And when someone comes to us and says, you have to model the resilience of N networks, and you only have N over 2 people on your team, all of whom are already committed, it's really tempting to panic. You freak out and say, there's no way we can possibly do that. Are we going to get fired? And it's tempting to half-ass everything just to get it done and never make any real progress. Our CSO here, Andy, is giving a keynote talk about this, which I highly recommend. Calls it security subsystems syndrome. Put simply, it's the notion that because you can't do everything, you therefore can't do anything. And the answer, I'll leave it up to him to describe it tomorrow, but the quick answer is to focus on making real solid improvements, one area at a time, where you can, and don't sweat the whole thing. We also, at Akamai, actively focus on training others and imparting the security mindset elsewhere in the company. One unusual thing that I've found about our team is that we're happy when someone makes an internal transfer elsewhere in the company. Sure, we're sad to see them go, but we've also found that we see better security results coming out of that area of the company afterwards, because the security mindset is spreading. If we focus on making people aware, rather than doing all of the work ourselves, we find that it really, really helps when it comes time to get things out of other people in the company. So the second area of challenge is technical. Complex systems. Our networks and code are unbelievably complex, and I'm sure this is familiar to a lot of you. We're expected to make very confident declarative statements, like this is safe or this is insecure, when all we have the time to understand is the surface layer. We can do a deep dive, but that will consume so much of our time. And as I previously mentioned, we don't have a lot of that available. Our networks and systems are incredibly complex. I say 3 to 5 years ago, the Akamai network became so complicated that no human, no matter how smart, and I believe we have some of the smartest people in the world working for us, no matter how smart they are, they can't possibly fit its whole operation into their heads. At that point, we stopped being engineers, and we started being physicists. What do physicists do? They're dealing with the incredible complexity of the universe. How do they handle that? They create models, simplifications of the world, and they test their new data and their new assumptions against those models, constantly updating facets of belief about the world. We have to simplify. Every scientist who works with complex systems does. We have to create simple models, and we have to test our assumptions against them. And like a good scientist, we have to always be willing to update what we believe about the world, to throw away false beliefs and get new ones. We also have to display adaptability. I've written epidemiology up here because sometimes that's the mindset we're forced into. If we don't care about root cause analysis in the middle of a crisis, we have to look, what's causing it? How can we fix it as soon as possible? And then we'll figure out what's ultimately causing it. We're thinking like epidemiologists. So we have to display adaptability, we have to create models, we have to test them, we have to update them, and we have to throw them away when they're no longer valid. That's how we deal with complex technical systems. And the third and final challenge is human. This will be familiar to any security team. We see ourselves as paramedics rushing in to save a direly wounded patient, and they look at us and we're greeted like the IRS coming in for an audit. Why are you guys here? You're here to make me look ashamed. You're here to make me look bad in front of my boss and my boss's boss, and you're going to expose all these terrible security holes in my application, and then I'm going to get fired, and I will have to go work somewhere else. And this fear is entirely natural, especially given the attitude that people automatically assume that InfoSec is coming in with. This is entirely normal. So what do we do about it? Kindness and understanding are our most powerful allies here. We don't want to have an adversarial relationship with other people in the company, just the code. We want to empower people to make their own security decisions. We want to help them and not hurt them, because that ultimately helps us too, and it ultimately helps Akamai. If we build relationships with people, the next time we come in, rather than saying, oh, you guys are going to make me look bad, I'm going to stonewall you and push you off and delay you just so, because you guys don't understand that we built all this under incredible time pressure, like I mentioned earlier. They say, wow, thank God you're here. And we find that the second time we come to talk to a lot of people, that's the reaction we get, which means we must be doing something right. So we want to empower people. We want to give people the opportunity to make their own decisions about security. Oftentimes, security professionals will come in with this attitude of, I'm smarter than you, let me take a look at it, let me tell you what's wrong, and then you can fix it, and the next time I'll come in and tell you what's wrong and you can fix it. We want people to be able to look at their own code and say, wait a minute, that's not right. And the next time we show up and they'll say, hey, look at all the stuff we fixed without you having to say anything. And that's great. When it comes to us having limited resources, that's exactly what we want. So that's the third challenge, and that's how we deal with it. Economic, technical, and human challenges. With that, I'm going to talk about how adversarial resilience actually does what it does. I've broken that out into an 8-step outline of a process. In real life, obviously, things aren't this regimented. We don't have a big checklist on the wall saying we have to go through all of this. And there are multiple entry and exit points into this whole process. I'll be calling them out as we go. But this should give you a good idea of how the adversarial resilience team evaluates a new vulnerability, or, if you look at the first 2 steps, actually creates one. Any individual researcher on our team is going to be going through 1 to 3 products or specific attacks at once. So we'll be in multiple phases of this process at the same time. It does require quite a bit of juggling, but we manage. So at each phase, you'll see on the slides, I've noted down a specific question we're trying to answer before we feel like we can move on to the next phase. This doesn't necessarily mean that we're the ones who have to come up with the answer, but ultimately we need an answer to that question before we can move on. So the first step is research. It means understanding the environment. I know I said we can't perfectly predict the next attack, but like I said, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. This means understanding the technology and the landscape. It means knowing the adversary. One of us might have contacts at ISPs. One of us might keep in touch with unsavory types on Pastebin and .ru forums. One of us might keep in touch with others in the company to see what they've seen. And one of us might read the full disclosure forums. All of us are constantly keeping our skills sharp. We're trying to figure out, where's the next attack coming from? We want to come out of this process with an idea of where we should be looking. And this could be a bunch of different areas. One common entry point into this process, and I'll call this out at the end, is from the end of a previous process. We'll be looking at some code and think, that might make a good DOS attack vector. We should test that when we have more time. So when we're in this phase, this is blue sky evaluation. This is where we close the black box. We don't want to be knowing too much about our own systems. When we're trying to come up with an attack from the outside, we want to be probing the way an adversary would. Or we might want to look at how actual adversaries are probing us and see what they might find, trying to stay one step ahead of them. So we're trying to answer, where's the next attack coming from? Once we have that, we can proceed to the next phase. Development, the twin to research. This is where we start coding. We're coding something up that might turn into an attack. One of my colleagues is very fond of regular expression engines, for example. He finds them very useful as an attack vector. If you can create a giant regular expression, and you know a place where an attacker can provide a regular expression, then maybe that's a good DOS vector. I personally like looking at protocols, searching for asymmetric client-server work imbalance. If I, the client, can force the server to do way more work than I'm doing, maybe there's a DOS vector there. So ultimately, I'm coding up a bunch of stuff here, testing it out, and seeing how our system responds. This is where we might start in the process if we get handed an existing attack, something we pulled off the shelf, something a tipster handed us, something we found as a proof of concept, and so on. So the next step is experimentation. This is the first round of testing. We're looking for anything out of the ordinary here. We're hunting down anomalies. CPU load, memory usage, traffic imbalance, a spike in the time required to serve content. I mentioned before that the purpose of this process is to evaluate our own resilience. We want to determine how this new attack is going to change the resilience picture. So if we can, even if we're not causing high CPU load, even if we're not causing high network traffic, if we're causing an increase in the time required for us to serve traffic to the end user, that's significant. That could change the resilience picture. So that's what we're looking for here. One of the biggest ways we might affect our ability to serve content is if we can crash our server, which has happened more than once. We'll load up our test net, we'll target it with the attack tool, we'll run it, and bam, it goes down. So here's where we start peeking inside. The black box. We're looking for what effect we're having, and we need to have internal visibility in order to see what effect that is. One of my colleagues asked me when I was demoing this presentation, so what separates you from a fancy red team? And I think this point here is critical, because we call in engineering from the very beginning. We want engineering to be involved. I'm using the term engineering here to mean the people who actually wrote the software you're testing. So this might be software development or wherever, depending on where you're working. But making them stakeholders, making your software developers stakeholders, and having them involved from the very beginning, saying, look, we just found this thing and we want you to help us with it. It means that when it comes time to present this to management in a couple of steps, they're on our side. This can actually come as a surprise to people who expect engineering to be fighting against us. When we're saying, hey, this is a big problem, we need to fix it, and they say, engineering, what do you think? And engineering says, yeah, this is a big problem, we need to fix it. We present a unified front. By making them stakeholders, by having them invested in the fix for this attack, we find that we get that support, we empower them, and we tell them what sort of things they should be looking for when they're writing their next iteration of code. Again, we're being helpful and we're empowering. Next, the real testing begins. Deep testing. This is where we look at the whole system. We look at the interactions between things. We try to find the root cause if there is one. Sometimes there isn't. Sometimes we're looking at what we like to call a systems interaction failure. All of our components are operating properly. They're operating up to spec, but because of a flaw in the way that they're designed to interact, because some assumption that one team made isn't true for another team, that's causing a problem. We want to figure out how easy this attack is to mount. We want to figure out how likely is it that the attacker is going to come up with this. Ultimately, we're still concerned about it if it's not something that they could trivially discover. But if it's something that someone could pick up off the shelf and attack us with in the next 10 minutes, we're really worried about that. We want to know that right away. So we want to know, how worried should we be? Again, we're continuing to work with engineering throughout this whole process. We're making them stakeholders. The black box is fully open at this point. They're doing debugging. They're figuring it out. And we're working with them to do that. So the next step is modeling. This is another interesting thing that we do. One of my coworkers really likes statistical methods. He came up with this idea. We have to acknowledge that it's not just a single server that we're testing against. We have to test in the world of networks. Since Akamai has so many points of presence around the world, and since an attack, a distributed denial of service attack, is going to come from many different places in the world, how do we effectively model that? Sometimes the answer is to test against the actual network, but for a variety of reasons, as you might imagine, that can be a little infeasible. So we need to take the whole network into account, but we need to acknowledge that we can't model the attacker, we can't simulate the attacker perfectly. For one thing, I don't own a botnet that big. So we want to run a Monte Carlo simulation. In other words, we generate a whole bunch of simulated attackers, we generate a whole bunch of simulated attack points, and then we see where attacks ultimately get mapped to, geographically speaking, and taking into account the topology of the network. Does this hit a weak point? Do we have a weak point against this attack? Are we worried about this? How big of a hit can we take? If it hits a strong point, maybe we can take a much bigger hit. Otherwise, if it's directed, for example, if we simulate a bunch of attackers in Europe, and we find that in this particular location in Europe, we only have a few servers serving this network, we might start to get worried. When we take into account legitimate customer traffic, what we're trying to figure out is what we like to call headroom. Say we have 100 gigabits of customer traffic per second. And this attack can displace 200 gigabits of traffic. So if we have 300 gigabits of capacity, then maybe we're not so worried about that. If we have 200 gigabits of capacity, that becomes a serious worry immediately. So once we figure that out, we're trying to figure out, does the attacker need to hurt us, and what do we need to defend? We're trying to figure out the attacker resource consumption ratio to the defender resource consumption ratio. And once we figure that out, what can we do about it? Part of our role is to present this information in a way that executives understand. We're trying to present a view of the world, sometimes with little buttons that they can tweak, that gives a good model of how this attack is actually going to interact with our resilience picture. We're trying to figure out a way for executives to easily answer these questions. How easy is it to fix? What is the time frame? Who's going to fix it? And sometimes, is it worth it? If we have an attack, we have lots of headroom, it's hitting us in a strong point, maybe we don't have to worry about it, especially when we have a bunch of other attacks in the lineup that might be hitting us next. We want to know how to prioritize our resources. Ultimately, of course, it's not InfoSec making that decision. It's executives. But our role is to help executives make that decision by providing them with a good model, by providing them with a way to understand the world. The next step is support. At this point, we're not developing more code. At this point, we're not running any tests. We're shifting entirely into a support role while the fix gets developed. Remember, we're actively involved with engineering. This might mean we're helping them integrate our attack into their regression tests. I did this just last month. It's really convenient when you can provide an engineering team with a way to run an attack at the push of a button against a testnet of their choice. So they can say, well, we have a potential fix, and rather than going through us directly, they can say, well, we ran your regression test that you provided, and it looks like this fixes the problem. So we help them verify that. We're keeping executives in the loop. We're keeping engineering apprised. Remember, we don't own the fix, and we don't own the product, but we're there to help. Our goal is to empower, and our goal is to build relationships, and our goal is to help engineering and executives. So once that's done, once it's pushed out, during this process, we're constantly monitoring. In the last several steps, we made a lot of assumptions. We said, this is what the world is going to look like. When we're building our model, we said, this is how big an attack might be. Ultimately, these are educated guesses. So what happens if we get information that one of those guesses is wrong, that our model of the world is incorrect? Again, we've had to simplify by necessity. So if something happens that causes us to need to update our view of the world, then we update that real fast. We go back to one of our previous steps. We say, does our model need to change? Does our fix need to change? Does our attack need to change? We're testing to see whether any of that's true. And once that's done, we want to test to see if it's closed. Did we fix the problem? Our regression tests, are they okay? And did we kick up anything else? Did our attack and did our testing process produce anything that might cause us to say, that might be a good DOS attack vector? If we're investigating a protocol, if we're looking at a system, does it have any weak points that we might want to evaluate? Remember, our role is to help everyone honestly assess how resilient we are and to improve that. So if we find a place where our assumption isn't holding, if we find a place that might make a good DOS attack out of that, then we need to start testing that. So we take that and we use it as an entry point to step 1 or 2. Start evaluating a new attack. Are we ultimately safer out of this, is the question we want to answer. Sometimes a fix might make the problem worse. If we manage to filter out a bunch of incoming traffic that was causing a DOS attack, but our filtering solution is so expensive that under actual attack conditions, our filtering systems will go down, and DOS we need to have better tests, we need to update our assumptions, and we need to update our model of the world. So once we can confidently answer, to the best of our ability, that yes, we're safe, that's where our involvement is. But there's still another important step left. That step is reflection. One of the things I like the most about the InfoSec team at Akamai is that we're constantly striving to make ourselves better. We're constantly looking for ways in which we can improve our own thinking. This might mean learning some new technology, but it also might mean correcting the way that we think, making ourselves better at thinking about these things. And we're working with each other to do that. So after a process like this, we'll sit down and say, what did we learn out of this? How can our processes be better? Do we need to add steps? Do we need to remove steps? Maybe we need some new people here. Did we get any new leads out of this? Not just for DOS attacks, but for places we might build relationships, for things we might want to investigate, for a new system we might want to build. Because we can go to someone and suggest, it might be a good product if we built this thing. What did we learn out of this? That's the question we ultimately want to answer. Anyway, that's the 8-step process. I'm coming to the end of my talk, but I want to summarize things here. We start with an adversarial mindset. We're willing, even gleeful, to break our own things. We model the attacker. We think like the attacker. We're willing to attack or even DOS our own systems before the attacker does. in order to honestly assess how resilient we are. We use statistical techniques and create models of our own systems. Sometimes those models are black box models, sometimes they're deep analyses of our own systems, but ultimately we want to honestly understand how resilient we are. Only then can we hope to conduct adversarial resilience at a planetary scale. We want to be part of the solution. We want to help out, we want to be kind and available, and build relationships with other people in the company. We want to close the loop at the end, make sure we're safe, and at the end we reflect and learn and use what we know to make ourselves better. So that's what I got. Any questions? Yeah, go for it. Have we become too reliant on Akamai? Not reliant enough. I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that there are other cloud delivery providers out there. You might ask, are we too reliant on backbone services? Are we too reliant on backbone routers? Ultimately, we're a giant distributed system. A lot like the routers that run the internet. We're a giant distributed system, a lot like internet service providers like Comcast. So the internet is reliant on us, but the internet is reliant on a lot of things. And is that going to change in the future? I honestly don't know. More questions? All right. Thanks very much. I'd be remiss if we didn't mention that we're hiring, and if this sounds like fun to you, if coming at it with the adversarial mindset sounds like fun, then feel free to scan that QR code. It goes to the jobs page, or just type that in, and feel free to contact me directly one way or the other. I'm always available. Thank you all very much.